I have been speaking to you, the music sets the stage, and you'll see why as I progress through my story. And I wish Cindy were still here. I would thank her profusely for bringing the selection of music that she did. I call my life story the crossroads of change. And if it sounds like I'm reading this, I am. I had to put this down on paper because I probably would have lost myself in trying to talk about my story. So please bear with me. And I was raised Catholic, and religion taught me some basic truths. There is a God. It gave me boundaries. It taught me right from wrong, which I think is rather important. It gave me common sense, solid reasoning, and personal responsibilities. I was taught the discipline of critical thinking, take nothing at face value. 8 years of parochial school taught me that. Then along came the 60s and 70s. You know, whatever feels good, do it. There are no absolutes. Truth is relative. Does it sound familiar? Nothing has changed. My world was turned upside down, and I must admit, I crossed the line and I gave up on religion almost altogether. I always believed there is a God, just not a personal God. That's not what we were taught. At that point, I lived according to my desires. I did my own thing, but always in the back of my mind, there's got to be more to life than this. And as my life progressed, I soon began getting very tired of the struggle. I wanted more out of life than the life that I was leading. Now, by this time, I had a wife and 2 children in a very unstable marriage, and I began to ask the questions. Is this all there is? Does my life matter? There must be more to life than this, and what about God? I think God was beginning to work on me, and I didn't even know it at the time. Then it began. One spring day in 1980, Pastor Gary Sifford walked into my life. Jack knows Pastor Gary. At that time, I was managing a gas station just down the street from Blackman's Corner in Molalla. I was working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Some days were busy and some days weren't. Pastor Gary came into the gas station in the middle of the day, in the middle of the week, just to talk to me. He was a regular customer, so I was pretty much at ease with him. And I didn't even know he was a pastor at the time. Until he said, God has his hand on you. Well, that caught my attention. For the next hour, in my office in the gas station, Pastor Gary told me why. And once you know it, I didn't have any customers for that entire hour. He shared the story of Christ. And it was something relatively new to me, but because I was Catholic, I knew some of the stories. But I didn't know about a personal God. Well, my heart must have been wide open because I soaked up everything like a sponge. And interestingly, much of what I learned as a Catholic started to make sense, but without the religion. What I already knew was God is the Alpha and the Omega. He created the heavens and the earth and everything in it. Adam and Eve sinned and were put out of the Garden of Eden. Christ, the Son of God, was born, lived a life on earth, and was crucified for our sins. And that just about sums up my knowledge, aside from the history of Catholicism. What I didn't know at the time, that mankind was created because God wanted to have fellowship with him. What? Sin entered a perfect world through Adam, and that relationship was severed. What? And God had a plan. He sent his son to the world as a perfect sacrifice, giving up his life that we may be saved. I mean, what Pastor Gary said was really resonating with me. And through that one act, the relationship between God and man was restored. Wow, Again, I didn't know anything about a relationship. And we now have a living hope. And through the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, we have a helper who guides us through this life on earth. This is this kind of things that he was talking to me about. And whatever I heard from him, I really took it to heart. At that point, Pastor Gary prayed for me, and that was the last time I saw him until several years later. I'll tell you what, I was pumped. I was excited. All those kinds of things really spoke to my heart. I flew through the rest of the day. And as I drove home at the end of the day, my heart was racing with the news. And as I shared my experience with my then wife, who was pregnant with our third child, I think I saw her eyes beginning to glaze over. And as I finished, she simply said, "I think you've been out in the sun too long." Well, that was the end of that. Or so I thought. God had other plans. 3 months later, Greg Lundquist, a deacon at the local Conservative Baptist church, pulls in for gas. And I've never seen this guy before. And he's a local paint contractor, and the sign on his canopy said Mastercraft Painting. Now, since my dad is a paint contractor and I worked with him, I thought we had something in common. So I struck up conversation. And I felt compelled to ask him at the time if he was hiring. He said he'd get back to me. And 1 week later, he pulled in again and hired me right on the spot. What I didn't know is that God was handing me off to another man of God. I now work with him through the summer, and not once did he start a conversation about God or religion, but his example spoke volumes. Then my life as I knew it changed forever. Late August of 1980, my third child, my firstborn son, was born. And died just a day later. My wife and I were devastated. I was crushed, dazed, listless, obviously hurting. I think I cried every night for months. And the worst part about it was my wife and I struggled with our feelings apart. Now, she handled the pain in her own way, which I thought at the time was with bravery and strength. While I was emoting all over the place, she was stoic and steadfast. And I thought, wow, she's an awfully strong woman. Sadly, not once did we seek help with our pain. We really didn't have a clue what to do. And the people we hung out with had little to offer except condolences. Confused and reeling with pain, I quit my job working for Greg, which was probably the last thing I should have done, and spent the next year in perfect misery, seasoned with tiny rays of hope. And I kept telling myself, I'll be alive next year, just to live each and every day. Now, at the time, during this season, I had several part-time and full-time jobs just to stay afloat. And just as I began experiencing a ray of hope, my wife left me. I came home one spring day of 1981, only to find out the house was pretty much cleared out, and she had disappeared with our 2 children, and it would be months before I would see them again. And so began the summer of my discontent. Well, I had to hire an attorney. And for the entire summer, I spent my life in total confusion, living and reliving the experience of the previous year, all in the comfort of my own mind, if you can imagine what that was like. Finally, at the end of the summer, after a two-day court battle, it was all over. I now had an ex-wife and part-time custody of my children. And a couple of days later, I had a long-standing heated argument with my family, my own family. And they threw me under the bus. I had nothing, no wife, my kids were not with me, and my family disowned me. Well, at least I finally knew where I stood. At 1 o'clock in the morning, September of 81, I called Greg Lundquist. I hadn't spoken to him in months, but I think he knew what was going on. By the grace of God, he answered the phone at 1 o'clock in the morning. He listened to my story, and he led me in the prayer of salvation over the phone. Hey, Nick, I surrendered to a just and loving God. For the first time in over a year, I slept in peaceful slumber. When I woke up later that morning, my mind was clear. My emotions settled. It was as if I was a new creature, a new creation of life. And I was. And for the first time in my life, I felt that I mattered. I have a purpose, and God has a plan for me. And just to prove that He is God, He made a perfect impression on me. Yep, I was laid off from my full-time job just a few months later, just before Christmas. And I thought, boy, does God have a sense of humor? But I was excited. My attitude had changed. My whole outlook in life had changed. And I said, what is God up to? At that time, I had been going down to Astoria every other weekend to work on my attorney's hotel. It was a dilapidated building, obviously purchased as a tax deduction, but I was doing this to pay off my attorney's fees. That was pretty cool because I had no money. And I came home one Sunday evening to a message on my answer machine. Yes, there were answer machines back then. It was my attorney. He said his brother was looking to hire someone to run errands, help out in the office, and do odd jobs. I thought, well, why not? So I called him the next day, and talking with him directly, he made an appointment to see me later in the week. This is where it gets interesting. It was downtown Portland. I'll never forget the address, 2100 Southwest 1st. And the company was an investment firm called Capital Consultants. I had no idea what I was getting into because I was basically a blue-collar worker, and here I was staring at a white-collar job. Well, the drive to that company was about an hour. So I took my time, put on my best duds. Now, I'm from Molalla at that time. Flannel shirt, boot-cut jeans, my best and only pair of cowboy boots, and for the first time in my life, hair down to my shoulders. The only thing I didn't have was a big shiny belt buckle. So that's all I had. Now, picture all of that walking into an investment firm in downtown Southwest Portland. That had to have been a sight. As I walked into the building, I think I heard the receptionist chuckle when I walked up to her desk. I was almost inclined to use my best South Texas accent, but instead I told her I left my buckskin at the curb with its motor running. Well, actually, the color of my Chevy pickup was buckskin. I was ushered into my would-be employer's penthouse office and was asked to sit down. Now, he was on the phone. So I made the best of my time, but I had taken in all the aesthetics. Walnut desk, Persian carpet, perfectly coiffed plant arrangements, wall hangings with plenty of documentation proved that he earned everything in his office. The one thing I did notice, he graduated from the University of Oregon, so he was a duck. So I had an ace in the hole if I had to play that, because I followed the Ducks all the time. But finishing his conversation on the phone, he hung up and introduced himself. Said he was a majority owner of Capital Consultants, and he was looking for someone to work, get this, as a trader's assistant. Yep, trading stocks and bonds during the day and occasionally running errands. Are you kidding me? Okay. And at night, I was to be on call as his chauffeur. And by the way, that night was to be my first day of employment. And I was just about to decline his offer when he said, now listen to this. My brother speaks very highly of you. He says you're a man of integrity, someone I can trust. And then he said these words I'll never forget. I've got a gut feeling about you, and I want to hire you right now. He told me how much to start, and I thought, well, the pay isn't much. But I felt the Lord prompted me to take this job. And he looked me up and down. I think he kind of laughed. And then he asked me, do you have a suit and tie? And I said, well, no. And he gets on the phone and calls down to his clothing store, this high-end clothing store called Philip Stewart. He's talking to a guy on the phone. He says, I'm sending my guy down to you. Set him up with 2 pair of wool slacks, 4 dress shirts, 2 or 3 ties, 4 pair of socks, 1 sport coat, dark blue in color, and a pair of Cole Haans. That's a very expensive shoe, by the way. And oh yeah, a rain jacket, black. Put it on my bill. Really? But wait, there's more. Now, hanging up the phone, he asked me, watch this. What do you drive? I said, well, a pickup, of course. He said, that won't do. Sell it. I'm giving you a company car. Then he says, my brother tells me you've incurred a considerable amount of debt because of your divorce. I almost asked him, what else did your brother tell you? And I just simply said, yes, sir. He gets back on the phone and calls his bank. He says, hello, Steve. I've got a guy here that needs to consolidate some debt. So I'm co-signing for him to pay that off. He'll be down shortly to sign the papers. I'm sorry, did my chin hit the floor? Stunned, I think I thanked him. And he gets off the phone again. He then tells me to meet him that evening at his home in Dunthorpe, Lake Oswego, at 7 o'clock sharp. He and his wife were going out to dinner, and I was going to be chauffeuring that night. And then I said, okay. And as I was walking out the door, he says, oh yeah, get a haircut. Yes, sir. So I made my way down to the clothes store. It was an old building over by the stadium. And I thought, boy, this is not very impressive. Until I walked in. You never judge a book by its cover. And as I was waiting to be fitted, I noticed an open closet where customers would be coming in later on to pick up their clothing. The name tags read Tonkin, Schnitzer, Zidell, Ramsey. He was the coach of the Blazers. Paxson, Thompson, those were trailblazers. I thought, wow. And they treated me, a country bumpkin, like royalty. After all, I was. And it would be a week before my clothes would be ready. So I showed up at my new boss's house promptly at 7 with the very same attire that I had on earlier. He introduced me to his wife, and she greeted me with, howdy, partner. He threw me his keys and told me to fetch the car. Wait for it. Walking into the garage, I was thinking Lincoln Continental or Cadillac. What was in there was a Rolls-Royce Silver Shadow, brand spanking new. With just a bit of trepidation, I started the car, successfully backed it out of the garage, pulled it around, and picked up my ride. Did you follow all that? Did you follow it? This is what God did to me, did for me to prove he is God. And the rest is history at that point. God chose 2 men of God to touch my life before I even knew Christ as my Savior. They, Pastor Gary Sifford and Greg Lundquist, believed in a redemptive God who will do exactly what he says he's going to do. These men believed in me, and I had no clue. They had eyes to see and ears to hear, and I thank God for those men. And to prove that he is God and he can do anything, he chose two wealthy businessmen who happen to be Jewish to bless me beyond belief. And I've just told you my story. My life was heading for disaster, and he set the table beforehand. And after disaster struck, he added dessert. And just at the right time, bringing the right people, he showered me with blessing. Why? Because I asked the question, is there more to life than this? Yes, my life matters. All life matters. And the world needs to know that. And everything that happened was in God's perfect timing, his perfect timing. I want to share with you a loan sign a friend of mine gave me that has affected dozens and dozens of people, and I'll tell you why. It's probably looking at it backwards, but it says, you matter. And it says, don't give up.
Yeah, for acid.
This gal who is local makes signs like this, and she sells them. And I was talking to my friend, and he told me about her, and I said, I'd like to have one. And he said, when you put it on your lawn, expect responses, positive responses. When this gal put this sign for the first time in her lawn, she got dozens of phone calls. You know who they were? People who were thinking about committing suicide. They called her and thanked her for saving their lives. Christians and non-Christians, it doesn't matter. She impacted people's lives in a positive fashion, just like these two men did, just like these four men did. You have no idea what your life means to other people. You have a story. You have a life-changing story that you can share because your life matters. Now, our mission is to share God's love, as Jack had pointed out, because the world is starving for love. And it doesn't have to be by word. Deed says a lot. You are a perfect example of God's love. It is said that you can't take anything with you when you go to heaven. I say, yes, you can. You can take your family, your friends, and as many as the Lord introduces you to by sharing Christ's love and his salvation. Just don't do it on your own. So I say, we can bring people with us. It's not a vacuum. Those aren't my words, by the way. Those are Lou Holtz. He was the head coach from Notre Dame and also South Carolina. So when I heard that, I thought, oh, I have to share that. So that is my life-changing story. Oh, by the way, remember Pastor Gary Sifford? Well, came back around. I was at my friend's family picnic at Friar Park several years later, and I spotted Pastor Gary several yards away in another group chatting with some folks. I thought, what timing. I made my way over to him and stood behind him, smiling. He didn't know I was there. The gentleman that he was talking to was looking past Gary and looking straight at me, and I think that got Gary's attention, so he turned around and looked at me. And I asked him, do you remember me? Throwing his eyes wide open, he said, "Yes, I do." And I asked him if he remembered what he told me, and he said, yes, he did. And I said, well, from that day on, my life was totally ruined. He stared at me, and his friends behind him sucked in their breath, waiting. I reached out and gave him the biggest hug I could muster, and I thanked him because he knew my life mattered. I thought that was a nice fitting ending or nice closure to that season in time by meeting the person who started everything. And I let him know how much I appreciated him taking the time, just 1 hour, to come in because God told him to. That's pretty much the end of my story. But you might find this interesting. This is interesting. I surrendered my life to Christ 13 months after my son died. I met Sylvia 13 months after that. We were married on the 17th day of March, St. Patrick's Day, 17 months after we first met. And we were both born on Thursday, 17 months apart. Jeremiah 29:11 is one of my favorite verses. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. He's telling you, plans to prosper you and not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. The day after I surrendered, I had hope, I had a future, and I still do. Blessings.